Start tonight in Judges chapter 11. If you want to turn over there. Last week we kind of went through very quickly the first 11 verses. So Lord willing, tonight we're going to look through the rest of chapter 11 and then also chapter 12 and finish up the story of Jephthah. And then at the end of it, I'm just going to make mention of it because I doubt we get to the end of chapter 12. But there are 3 other judges that are recorded there, about 8 verses about them. So I'll just let you guys read about them on your own, and you can kind of deduce what you can get out of it. Question number 1 on our handout is a think about it question. But the question is this: have you ever regretted a decision or a promise that you made? Let's have a show of hands. Anybody ever regret a decision or a promise that you made? I think that's about everybody, right? Yeah, I'm as a father, sometimes I think it's good to try to motivate my children, and so I'll think about, something rewarding for them and say, hey, if you get good grades or if you get this done, then this is what I'll do for you. And at the time when I say it, it sounds good, and it sounds like something that I want to do. And usually, I'll be honest, when I make that promise, I think, they'll never do it, But when they do, you think, hey, I shouldn't have done that, Shouldn't have said that or made that promise. There's a lot of, I think, decisions that we make in life, or sometimes promises that we made that we wind up regretting. And of course, tonight we're studying about Jephthah. And Jephthah was a guy who made a promise. Did he wind up regretting that promise? Well, I hope he did, but it seems like from the scripture that he certainly did. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But before we get into the actual vow that he made and the fulfillment of that, we're going to read a little bit, or talk a little bit, I guess, about how he delivered Israel from the Ammonites. And question number 2 on our handout, it really deals with the entire story that you find there in chapter 11. But it says, what strategy did Jephthah use to save Israel from the Ammonites? I kind of want to start at the beginning and just kind of think about in the very beginning of this process of Jephthah delivering Israel, how did he start this process? What was the first thing that he did? Yeah, and actually if you start looking there in verse 12, it says, now Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the people of Ammon, saying, what do you have against me, that you have come to fight against me in my land? Did Jephthah start by mobilizing an army? What did he do at the very beginning? He sent these messengers and find out what's going on. And what do you think his purpose is in doing that? Yeah, a peaceful negotiation, right? He's thinking, well, maybe we can figure this out, and figure out what the cause of this problem is, and we can negotiate a little bit, and we can work these things out. Did it work? No, why not?
They were blaming him.
Go ahead.
Well, they was blaming Israel for something and I thought he used pretty good thoughts to overcome that.
Yeah. So basically, they were looking at Israel as the ones who were in the wrong, right? What did you say, Steve?
Well, he went to great lengths to explain why they weren't being wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, he certainly tried to reason with the king of Ammon, didn't he? He tried to negotiate with him and get him to understand, but I think the bottom line was, these people were greedy people and they wanted what the Israelites had, whether it was land or property or possessions or whatever. And so they wanted to fight in order to secure those things. But I think that's important to point out because, Jephthah wasn't looking for a fight, was he? I mean, he wasn't this hot-headed guy out here just trying to start a war. He knew that a war was serious business, and he knew that war could lead to death. And many of his own people might die in this war. And so if there's any way possible, he's trying to negotiate with the enemy here, and so that they don't have to go through this battle. Okay, so what reason, question number 3, we kind of answered it already. I think Dennis mentioned it, but what reason did the king of the Ammonites have for attacking Israel? Remember, Jephthah asked the question there in verse 12, why is it that you come to fight against me? And what was the reasoning that the king offered him? Yeah, he said, you guys stole our land, You took our land when you came up out of Egypt, and now we want our land back. And so basically he tells him, if you guys will just return all the land east of the Jordan, we don't have to fight. Just give up all that possessions that you have over there, and everything that you built, you've established, and we don't have to go to war. So Jephthah sends a series of messages to the Ammonite king, and that's found in verses 14 through 27 there. I've written down there's basically, I think, about 4 arguments that Jephthah uses to try to persuade the Ammonite king that he is the one who's in the wrong, and that this land really belongs to Israel. And so as you look through those verses, what are some of the arguments you can see that he makes that would be valid and reasonable, logical points? Well, how did Israel come to possess this land in the first place?
Because God.
Okay.
Whenever he told him that he couldn't pass the land.
Yeah, exactly. If you remember when Israel comes up out of the land of Egypt, of course there's a great number of them when they come out of the land of Egypt, and a lot of these places that they went through, they would send ambassadors before they would come to these places, and they would ask safe passage through their land. Remember, they said, we're not going to take anything from you. We're not going to fight with any of you. We just want to pass through your land, and we want you guys to let us go through. What did most of the nation say? Absolutely not, right? And Ammon was one of those areas where Israel sent ambassadors and asked to pass through, but the king, I think at that time was Sihon, he wouldn't allow it. And in fact, what did Sihon do? Not only did he not allow it, but what did he do? Yeah, he assembled an army, and he actually went out and surprise attacked Israel, So not only did he not allow them to pass through the land, they weren't trying to fight with him. They didn't want a war with him. But he actually attacks them, and of course God grants them the victory, and because of that, they wind up having all that land east of the Jordan River. Now that's not where they were initially going, right? But that's what happened because of the actions of the Ammonite king. Yeah, Ammon wasn't he a son of Lot? Is that right? I think so. Yeah, so one's a descendant of Lot and one's a descendant of Abraham. So they're pretty close, aren't they? Yeah, a lot of those nations there were related in one way or another. But here they were fighting over the land. Has that changed any today? Still fighting over the land, aren't they? Who does this belong to? Well, Jephthah is using this historical argument. The point that he's making is we weren't the ones in the wrong. We didn't come here to take your land away from you. You guys attacked us. And we defeated you and conquered you, and because of that, we inherited all this land. So don't try to blame us for having this land east of the Jordan River. What's another argument that he made? I called that one the historical argument. What happened in history? What would be another one that you see in there? What's the theological argument that he uses here?
God gave us this land.
Yeah. How was it that they came to inherit this land? He said, well, it's because our God, Jehovah, gave us this land. He says, what did Shemesh, your God, give you? Did he give you this land? No. So according to divinity, this is where we're supposed to be. The gods have fought or the gods have worked it out. And a lot of times when you read about these battles, of course, when one nation would conquer another, they would give credit to their God for being able to do that. And in essence, they viewed that their God was bigger and more powerful than the God of the other nations. And so Jephthah is kind of using that argument or throwing it in his face. Pretty evident that our God wanted us to have this land, and our God is stronger than your God. You know, Chemish couldn't beat him. And so from a theological standpoint, it made sense. What's another argument that he makes there? How about a legal argument? Do you see a legal argument in there anywhere? Okay. That's part of it. Does anybody else see any other things that you could add to that? Go ahead.
They didn't try to take it back.
Yeah. How long had Israel had this land? Over 300 years, right? He said, where have you guys been for 300 years, you know? We've lived here. This land has been our possession now for the space of 300 years. And possessions is what? Possession is what? That's right, 9/10 of the law, right? So we've had this in possession for over 300 years here, right? We've occupied this land. And he points out, even, remember Balak, the Moabite king, he didn't want Israel to have this land either. And when they were coming toward the promised land, what did he do to try to get them defeated and out of that land? Do you remember?
Two things, actually. He wants the other guy, the prophet for hire, to say bad things, and then the prophet, what's his name?
Balaam. I think Balaam's who you think about. Yeah.
And then Balaam tells him how by incorporating the bill review.
Yeah. So remember, he tried to hire Balaam the prophet to curse Israel. He wanted God to curse them so that they could get kicked out of the land. He didn't want them staying there. Well, you know the story. We've studied it before. Balaam tried about every way that he could to imagine, you know, to try to pronounce a curse, but he ended up blessing them instead, right? And what Jephthah talks about there is, you know, Balak was a powerful king at that time. But he eventually came to the conclusion, this land is going to belong to Israel and there's nothing you can do about it. So he accepted that idea. And I think what Jephthah is basically saying, are you greater than that king? You know, this great king of the past understood that this land belonged to us. He acknowledged that. And we've lived here for over 300 years. You guys haven't taken it back. You haven't tried to. So why now do you think that this land suddenly belongs to you? And then there's one more argument I think that he presents here. Anybody able to see that one? Again, I just kind of labeled them as 4 ideas. Yeah. Basically, he says this. It's the personal argument. He said, I'm not the one in the wrong. You know, I'm not the one trying to start a fight here. I'm not the one trying to start a war. And if you're the person who's in the wrong and you're trying to start this fight and you're in this war, then let God judge between us. You know, let Jehovah be the judge as to who is going to live in this land, and you're going to find out you're the one in the wrong. So before any battle is ever waged, you know, I think Jephthah does an amazing job, and he was a pretty knowledgeable guy, wasn't he? I mean, you have to say he knew his history. Did he know about God? Yeah, he knew a lot about it. He knew about Israel's history. He knew about the great events of the past and how God had intervened and the things that he was able to accomplish for Israel. And he used about everything that he could try to use in order to avoid war. But eventually, like I said, the king of the Ammonites, pretty obvious he wanted to fight. So there wasn't anything that Jephthah could say or do that was going to change his mind. So how does the king of the Ammonites respond to Jephthah's message? Question number 5. Yeah, he totally ignored it, didn't he? It's like Jephthah didn't even say anything. Now, again, you think about those 4 points that Jephthah made. And if a guy was really reasoning and deducing and using logic, were those good points? I mean, every one of them was a valid point, wasn't it? But again, the king of the Ammonites, he didn't care about logic and reasoning. He just wanted to fight. He wanted that land. He wanted Israel's possession. And so he was bound and determined there was going to be a war between these two nations. All right, so we go through a little bit of that. And then we read about a vow that Jephthah makes. And what is that vow? Somebody want to read? Somebody read Judges chapter 11. There's a few names in there. Let's just do 29. Well, do 30 and 31. Let's do that.
And Jephthah vowed a vow to the Lord and said, Thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into my hands. Then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth at the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer them for burnt offerings.
Okay, so Jephthah makes this vow or this promise. And Jephthah, in my mind, he's trying to do what a lot of people have tried to do over the years, and that's make a deal with God. You know, you ever see or been around a person who says, I made a deal with God? Usually, who's going to come out on the short end of the stick? It's not going to be God, right? Because sometimes a lot of people think, it's never going to happen. You know, I made this promise to God. I made this agreement with God, but it's never going to happen. So I'm not going to have to worry about it. Think about it from this standpoint, though. Did Jephthah have to make this vow? God was already with him, wasn't he? I mean, he was already going to fight for him. They were already going to win this battle. He had no reason to make this vow. So why did he make it? Bargaining chip, right? Let's ensure that we're really going to win this battle. And so the way that we can do this is making this deal with God. You know, maybe God will be more set on us winning this battle now. So let me ask you this question. Do you think it was wise for Jephthah to make this vow? Why would it not be wise? Just think of some common sense reasons. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe he didn't like his wife.
Man, evidently she didn't like him because she wasn't first out, was she? I never thought of it from that perspective, Steve. Did he have any idea who or what was going to come through those doors when he came home? Absolutely none. Right?
Would that be his wife or his daughter?
Well, you would think, wouldn't you? But he talks about the idea of a burnt offering. I mean, do you think that's what he wanted for his daughter and his wife? I don't think he would. I think probably in his mind he was more persuaded that it was going to be some animal. You know, maybe they had some pets or something in that day and age. But in his mind he was convinced that he already knew what was going to happen, right? That's why he made the vow. But it was not a wise thing to do because he had no idea, again, who or what was going to come through those doors whenever he came home. So let me ask you this question. Did he sin in making this vow? No? Okay, anybody have a different perspective? Or everybody agree?
I don't think he did. I think he did.
Okay, so you would think that he did?
Because he was sacrificed for it.
Okay.
6 things the Lord made, except for God made. Because it's his blood.
Yeah. So it wasn't, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about this idea, but it wasn't a very smart thing that he decided to do. So I put a couple of questions in here that I want you to think about, and if you've heard me teach on this subject before, you probably already know where I'm going with it. But I want us to think about some of the things that we read about here and just some of the fundamental Bible teachings and principles that we can find. So we read about the vow that he made. And question number 7 is this. Do you think God wanted Jephthah to make this vow? I see some no's. Anybody say yes?
Well, he ultimately allowed him to make it.
Okay.
He could have said, hold it, don't need a vow, we understand each other, here we go. So, that was an option.
Okay. Do you think the vow in and of itself was sinful? Sinful. That's a violation of God's law. That's what I'm talking about here.
I think so.
Okay? Was it pretty common?
There's other vows that, turned out good. I mean,
Yeah. It was pretty common in that day and age for people to make vows, wasn't it? Yeah. Were there any Mosaical laws about vows? What were some of those laws?
If you make a vow, you keep it.
Yeah. If you make a vow, you keep it. If you make a vow unto the Lord, you better sure keep it, right?
But what good is it to make a sacrifice to God, or at least take something in? You give your best to God. I mean, for one reason, that's the reason I feel like it was a sinful vow. Is because I don't know what I'm going to give you, Lord, but I'll give you something.
Okay. So, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
And for that reason, it would be that's kind of a sinful vow. I don't know what I'm going to give you, but I'll give you something. I'm supposed to give you your best.
Okay. So, what if the vow that was made was against God's moral law?
That would make it sin.
Okay, so let me illustrate it. We know what happens in the story. Let me illustrate it to you a little bit differently. What happens if when Jephthah comes home, an unclean animal comes out first? You think it would have been right for him to offer that unclean animal as a sacrifice to God? Why not? Because it's a violation of God's moral law, right? So it's obviously something God wouldn't want and God wouldn't accept. Jephthah didn't have any idea what was going to come out. What about a human sacrifice? Is that good according to God's moral law? Is that something God wanted, God would accept? Go ahead.
Definitely not. But it's like, that's where you said it's kind of his bonehead move. He made a vow, which I don't think the vow itself was sinful by making it. But what happened, it all fell apart. He honored it, but I know he had to be displeased all the way through.
Okay, so basically, here's the dilemma that you're faced with, okay? You're faced with two choices. Okay, either number one, you can violate God's moral law by offering a human sacrifice, right? Which God has no desire. He doesn't want it. It's not acceptable to Him. Or you can break your vow that you've made to God, right? Which one's the lesser of the two evils?
I would say the breaking of the vow, because everything wraps around morality.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree too. But, God put Jephthah to the test, didn't He? Because do you think God knew what the first thing coming out through those doors was going to be when Jephthah got home?
Yes.
Absolutely. Would Jephthah do what he told God he would do? That was really the test. So,
It's kind of the same test Abraham.
okay, so that's a good point. Keep that in mind because I want us to come back to that and, we'll see how much time we have and talk about it a little bit. But I just want you to get your minds thinking along these lines, okay? So the question becomes this. What happened, number 8, as a result of Jephthah's vow to the Lord?
The daughter wants to go off and mourn for 2 months.
Okay?
That doesn't happen.
Yeah. And there's some great significance in this passage. If you notice there in verse 35, it says, "It came to pass when he saw her that he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it." The Bible also points out to us, I was looking for another verse here. I thought that one was the one. Let me look just a second. I didn't write it down. That's always a bad thing. Oh yeah, okay, verse 34. "So when Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing, and she was his only child." Did you catch that in the story? Okay, and then it says, "Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter." That's the only child that Jephthah had. And so here's the question. Did Jephthah literally sacrifice his own daughter to God? Okay, I see 1 yes, 2 yes.
Unless it says right there in verse 1,
Okay, he carried out his vow. That's what it says.
You know, I'd always been taught that he did. But I was over at Moody and heard a sermon on this very thing. And he put a different twist on it and said that he didn't actually literally sacrifice his daughter by killing her. He sacrificed his daughter by giving her to God to serve in the temple. So she couldn't never marry, couldn't never have kids, and that was the sacrifice.
Okay, so there's some interesting original language study that you can find in this passage, and it's mainly taken. Let me see here. What verses did I have down? Let me see if I can find it. Where's the vow that Jephthah makes?
31.
Verse 31. Okay, so it's interesting because in the Hebrew language, and I'm no Hebrew expert, I'm no Greek expert either. I've studied a little bit of both, but it's always interesting to me to study conjunctions. You know what a conjunction is? Something that joins two things together. Because one thing that you'll find about Greek and Hebrew conjunctions are they're very versatile. And there can be like 5 different meanings to the same conjunction. You know, it's translated all different ways through the Bible. But I bring that up because of the conjunction that's used here in this vow that Jephthah makes. So he says in verse 31, "Then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's," conjunction, "and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." Okay, so if you put the conjunction "and" in there, it basically means that Jephthah says, I'm going to devote whatever comes through that doors to God, and I'm going to offer them as a burnt offering. Well, didn't Jephthah know that people... do you think he had any inkling that a person might be the first thing that welcomed him home?
What else would it be?
You would think, right? So why would he make a vow like that if he knew that God doesn't want human sacrifices? It's not acceptable to him. He's not going to gain any favor by it. Why would he say, I'm going to burn a person up over here and give it to you, Lord? Does that make any sense to you?
So you're saying that he was giving her to God's service and he was going to prove it by offering some sort of burnt offering.
Okay, so let me translate the conjunction a little differently. It's translated both ways in the Old Testament, this conjunction that's used here. So he says, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, or I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Does that make any difference? Because what it means is that Jephthah understood he was making a 2-part vow here, right? In other words, in his mind, if it's an animal, I'll offer it up as a burnt offering to you. If it's a person, whatever person that is, I'll sacrifice that person to you. So, the question is this: what was the sacrifice that Jephthah made with his daughter? Go ahead, Matt.
I guess without changing a word in the Bible, what was the original language that was used? Because and or are 2 different things.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a versatile conjunction. I mean, you'll find it translated both ways throughout the Old Testament. It's one of these things where you got to look at it, and you got, as a Bible student, you got to say, which one is it? You know, context determines a lot of that. General Bible principles determine a lot of that. And sometimes that's the boat that you're stuck in with translation. It's not always easy. I always told you guys I don't envy translators because it would be a tough job. But sometimes it's translated, that conjunction there as "and" in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's translated as "or." So we got to decide which one is it going to be in this particular instance.
But I'm sure you've researched the original language. What does it say?
That's what I'm saying.
Is it still either or?
Yeah. That's the hard thing about conjunction, and it's true in both Hebrew and Greek. Because you could have 3 different meanings for the very same Lord. You got to look at the context and say, well, what does it mean in this context? You know, does it mean before? Does it mean pre? You know, there's all different kinds of things that it could mean. Does it mean by, or does it mean then? That's one of the great debates over Greek preposition, by or then. You know, because it can change the meaning of an entire passage. So when you get to a difficult place, that's what you have to do. You have to use a little bit of, I think, of logic and reasoning and common sense and consider Bible principles and teachings and say, now what is the translation that's in tune with what the rest of the Bible teaches? And so that's a difficult thing to do when you're translating. But I just want to point out, it can be translated as or. And if it is translated as or, if the translators had translated it or instead of and, would we be having this discussion tonight? No. It would completely change the idea and the meaning of the passage. Now, as you read, here's what I want to point out. As you read about what Jephthah does, is there anything in there that indicates that he ever killed her? Sacrificed her?
She remained a virgin too, so is it over or for a long time?
Okay, so you read about, he gives her 2 months to go out with her friends, and they're mourning the fact that she's never going to have any children, right?
Not mourning the fact that she's going to die.
Yes. Wouldn't you think they'd be mourning the fact that she was going to die?
I would think.
I mean, what's the greater tragedy? I mean, it was a tragedy not to have children, I understand that. But wouldn't you be more concerned that in 2 months your friend here is going to be put to death? Shouldn't that be the main cause of mourning?
If you keep reading on 39, then it says, who did according to his vow, which he had vowed, and she knew no man.
Yes.
So, and was later.
Yeah.
And she knew no man after the vow was already kept.
Yeah.
So
So, what does that indicate?
she's alive.
She's alive. That's what it indicates to me. How did he sacrifice his daughter to the Lord? And I think the answer is, who was it that talked about temple service? Somebody bring that up? Daryl. So, you could devote your children to temple service in that day and age. One of the qualifications of it was you had to remain unmarried. You couldn't have a husband or a wife if you were going to serve in the temple. There were women who served in the temple. You'll read about them throughout the Old Testament.
Was that kind of like Samuel?
Yeah, basically the idea like Samuel, right? He was devoted to the temple. Hannah brings him, leaves him at the temple. The tragedy of this is this. Think about this. What happened to the descendants of Jephthah? He only had one daughter. Okay, she was his one and only hope of ever having descendants. And was that important in that day and age?
Was the out of a daughter though? What did you have?
Well, the daughter could still be your inheritance. Remember, there was a law that was put in the law of Moses. You could still pass your inheritance on to your daughter. So he did have at least a descendant that he could have passed it on to, and then she would have, the theory was she would have had children, and she could have passed it down to her children. But the problem was this, the inheritance of Jephthah, it died with his daughter.
So that truly was the sacrifice that he made.
It was.
That was the end of his lineage.
It was a sacrifice for her because to go along with the vow and to not have children in that day and age, children were everything, to the Jewish nation. So she made a sacrifice. Jephthah made a sacrifice in that he basically forfeited all his inheritance and all his descendants by allowing her to enter into the service of the temple. So it's interesting to think about. Sometimes you read things on the surface and it seems really apparent, but if you stop and you start digging a little bit, there's maybe some more information that the Bible offers to us. And so there's some more questions on here. I hope you guys go home and think about them a little bit. One of them is this, number 10. If Jephthah sacrificed, I'm talking about offering as a burnt offering, literally sacrificed his own daughter, was God happy with that? What did God say about human sacrifice? He said, don't do it, right? Remember that, did God ever command human sacrifice? Now, I want you to stop and think before you answer that. Only one. Okay, who's that? Oh, how about the story of Abraham and Isaac? What did he tell Abraham to do? Sacrifice his son. But what happened when the time came to sacrifice? God said, I just wanted to test you to see if you do whatever I asked you to do, right? Did he really want a human sacrifice? No. that's never what he's been after with the human race. And so it's interesting, there's a lot of ramifications. If Jephthah literally did sacrifice his own daughter, I don't think he would have been in very good standing with God. Do you? So if you do, if that's the position that you take, then you're going to have to say which of these two violations of God's law is going to be the lesser of two evils. Is it sacrificing a human, or is it breaking a vow that you made to God? And understand this too. Read Leviticus chapter 27, because you could actually redeem a vow. If you vowed something to the Lord, there was a law within the law of Moses. Even with a person, you could go down to the temple and you could pay the proper price for that person, and you could basically get by with not keeping your vow to the Lord. So if I were Jephthah, you know what I'd do? If that was the vow that I made? And this guy had a lot of money because he just conquered all these enemies, right? He had the money to do it. But he could have paid that ransom and redeemed her and not had to put her to death and not violated this vow this law of keeping these vows to God. So there's a lot of interesting things to consider about it. We're out of time. Anybody have any thoughts, comments? Yes, sir.
Also, if he'd gone through it and continued to be a judge under God's service, that would have put God using somebody directly as like totally not in line with what he wanted. So that would hang.
Yeah, and that was one of the main concerns of God, is they wanted to be like all these other idol worshipers, Well, one of the ways you could have done it is by sacrificing humans. So what kind of example would he have been for the children of Israel? Yeah, good thought there.